Good morning. Welcome to the WorkNet to Page Virtual Job Club presentation of Developing Your Interview Stories. My name is Jim Fergal, and I'd like to welcome you today to our virtual job club. I am the manager of Job Seeker and Veteran Services, as well as the facilitator of the WorkNet to Page Job Club. We will be adding content and hope to have virtual videos and job clubs at least every Friday, as well as more content coming. So, let us start. The purpose of this workshop was that I found I was getting frustrated, not only with myself, but other job seekers, and when I was doing interviewing of candidates, about what behavioral interviewing is and how to develop answers. So today, the learning objectives will be, I'm going to explain, give a brief overview of what behavioral interviews are about, the reason for storytelling, how to prepare and present these interview accomplishment stories. I'll give you some guidelines for you to write and tell your story, and then streamline your answer. Now, all of this will be, we're going to record this. It'll be posted on YouTube, eventually on our website, which is WorkNet to Page, which is a job training organization. If you go to worknettopage.org, you will find that we are funded by the Workforce Innovation Act, or WIOA, and you can go there, see our calendar events, job seeker services, as well as we have funding for training right now, certification training, PMP, CDLA, healthcare positions, as well as certifications in IT. So please check that out, and I will say this again at the end. So I posted a bibliography on here because I found these books really help me understand behavioral interview and the storytelling process. What Great Salespeople Do are by Michael Bosworth and Ben Zolden. My sister, who's in sales, gave it to my son, and I started reading it, and it all came down to it's not close, close, close. It's be able to develop rapport with the customer, and that is through storytelling. Tell Me About Yourself is by Katherine Hansen. She beat me to the punch on writing a book, but it talks about how you develop your stories. And there's all different acronyms, CAR, SAR, whatever. But the concept is still the same, which we'll go over today. A Whole New Mind by Daniel Pink. He talks about there's 6 different senses that you'll need for the 21st century. The 4th is being able to tell a story. The Writer's Journey by Christopher Volger. He was a screenwriter, or evaluator for Disney, actually. And he had taken The Hero of 1,000 Faces by Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, and synthesized it down into something a little bit more in layman terms that you can understand. It really spells out the hero's journey, and he uses movies to help you understand what's happening in the plot, and so you can follow along when you watch any movie or read any story, what's happening. Resonate is by Nancy Girardi. This is about how to do presentations, how to develop stories, and in there she uses the hero's journey. Draw to Win by Dan Rome, and The Doodle Revolution by Sonny Brown is talking about drawing things out. What are the different types of stories, which I'll talk about in a little while. And probably a follow-on presentation that I'll be doing is how to use visual aids in your interview. So what is behavioral interviewing? Well, it's competency-based. It's based on skills, problem solving, your ability to work as part of a team. How do you handle stress, time management? And what it's doing is the interviewer is trying to figure out, are you going to be a good fit for our position? And I didn't say best qualified, I said the best fit. So behavioral interviewing is looking at how you act under pressure. And it asks about your past experiences, not hypotheticals. Now, the questions can be good or they can be bad, positive or negative. Tell me about a significant accomplishment, or tell me about how you dealt with a team member that wasn't pulling their weight. Now, the answers can't be memorized. You know, there's all sorts of books out there, 101 to 501 great answers to the toughest interview questions. Well, it's tough to memorize those. If you're trying to memorize 501 answers, chances are, under stress, you're going to give the wrong answer to the question. The great thing about behavioral interviewing is that it talks about, or the questions are about you, not anyone else. How did you act? And who's the subject matter expert of you but you? The premise is that past actions will predict future behavior. So they're going to ask you how you use certain skills, how did you react in different situations, what actions did you take, and they use that to predict how you're going to act in future. I've read everything from maybe interviews are 10% successful to when behavioral interviewing was used, it would jump up to, over 100% successful. There's a lot of factors in, but I know this is very prevalent. I know you're probably running into this, and you just have to be prepared with the stories or examples. When I say storytelling, I'm talking about examples that you're going to provide. So the traditional interview questions are what if questions. What would you do if you saw someone stealing company merchandise? Versus a behavioral question, which is focused on time. What did you do when you saw someone stealing company merchandise? Do you see? So there's a time element here. If is hypothetical. When, tell me about a time. Give me an example. These are real world stories that you need to come up with. Whenever you're in an interview, I know the focus is, I need a job, okay? I get that, been there many times. Just tell me what you want to do and I'll do it. But really you have to go beyond you. And one thing I learned as an Army officer is you have to jump to the other side of the desk, which means you got to think like the enemy. In this case, you have to think like the employer. What does the employer need? There's only two things. And if you keep this in mind, everything revolves around this. They want someone who's going to solve their problems and someone who's going to make them money. That's it. I don't care whether you're an admin assistant, forklift operator, sales rep, vice president of operations. It's all coming down to, we have a problem that needs to be solved and we want to be making money. And if you keep that in mind, when you develop your stories and develop your answers, we're going to talk about tying in your experience to the position and the employer's needs. This open position is a weakness for the employer. The longer the position goes unfilled, the more stress there is on other employees, and customer service declines. You are trying to fit their need. And your strengths, your skills, your education, your certifications, your experiences are all elements that will help you fit the need. So how do you prepare for a behavioral interview? Well, the first thing is you have to understand the core competencies of your industry. Now, it sounds simple enough, but some of you might be new to the industry that you're in. Or maybe you're transferring from one industry that has different terms than the industry that you're in. So here's what I'm looking at. When I got out of the Army, I wanted to get into training. And what happened was I wasn't using the right terms. And I used to work for unemployment, got laid off, and did some recruiting during that layoff time. And I met a trainer. And she was using all these fancy terms like needs assessment, curriculum development, instructional design. And I said, well, in the Army, we called it this. And she said, well, in my, in the training world, we call it this. So I was using the wrong language for the same competencies. So that's very critical for you to do, is pull several job descriptions if necessary, highlight the skills, and see what it says. Now, comb the job descriptions, look at common skills, and then look at your skills and experiences and stories you can tell, and then you prepare your stories for that. So let's talk about, how do you pull apart or deconstruct a position? Well, one is you read for an overview. Just quickly read the job description, just read it. And that's hard to do because I have a tendency to go deep dive right off the bat. But you got to pull yourself back and read it a second time, because first you're trying to say, okay, what are they looking for here? What's the scope, the authority? What role do they want you to play? Then you go back with a highlighter or whatever, and you highlight the skills and the tools, whatever they want you to do. And then you start pulling out your skills and accomplishments using those skills and tools that match. Then quantify. Dollars, numbers, percentages. And I know people freak out over this, because sometimes you can't. But numbers help. You might have been on a 7-person team. What was your contribution? How did that move along the project? How big was the project? Even if you saved $1 an hour on someone's job or something, that would be $2,080 a year you saved the company. Write out your stories about your skills and accomplishments. And this is tough. I have a tendency, I want to ad lib, but I have to write it out. When you write it out, it brings to the surface, which I'll talk about in a little while, but it reacquaints you with the experience. And then you start remembering everything you forgot. This is my setup for a story. SPART. The story setting, which most everyone forgets in the interview. What was the problem? What was the action? What were the results? And then tie it in to the job. I learned that in an interview. And then practice the story. Okay? Now, the first career conference I ever presented at, Thomas Moore, who wrote, Soulmates and Care for the Soul, was a presenter, which I found kind of odd, but he had gone through several career changes as well. Had been a monk, and now he was a therapist, and he's done a few other jobs. So he comes up with, in his book, he's talking about your whole life, he uses alchemy, is a process of events. Okay, and that's what, everything from the beginning to the middle to the end. But he comes in there and says, our life is all stories. And he has this story, this poem, Dreaming, by Robert Trammell. And I'm going to read it. Life is mostly remembered in bursts of stories, beautifully interwoven with people, places, and events. A word, a picture, a smell can set it all in motion. And you can close your eyes and see it clearly, as if it happened yesterday. When you sit around with friends, when you're sitting around the dinner table with your family, and the conversation is going, it's all talking about events, and we're all storytelling. whether we know it or not. And if you've been involved in it, you can picture the smells, the scene, whatever, what happened back when. And, when I get together with friends, we talk about things we did when we were kids or in school or sports. And you travel back in time. And that's what happens is when you're telling a story, you're going to see that it engages both you and the listener. So let's look at what is a story. The story is an account of an incident or different number of incidents that might be real or imaginary. There's a hero or heroine, can be the CEO, admin assistant, sales rep, member of a team. But the format is always the same. The main character, which in your stories is going to be you. What's the plot? There's going to be some sort of conflict with a villain, because without villains, there's no story, and there's no need for the hero. And then a resolution. What was the result? So I think it's easy to think of it this way, the story train. There's always a beginning. There's a middle, which escalates up to a critical point, and then it goes to the end. So let's look at what storytelling does. One, it helps you with your identity of who you are. It builds confidence in yourself. When you look at the things you did, we have a tendency to have Teflon ponchos on where we let our accomplishments slide off of us. But you need to get some Velcro and let those stick. You'll be much more confident going into that interview when you know your stories and you know what you can bring to the table. It also allows you to see your personality. The format that I showed you gives you a logical way to present your story in the interview. And that's key. A lot of people ramble, go round and round the mountain rather than getting to the point. I remember reading once about a recruiter. He was on a telephone interview with a candidate. And he says, I was on the phone for half hour, only got to ask 2 questions because the candidate talked for 15 minutes. I will give you this format to help you understand how to present and keep you, let's say, in the fence rather than out roaming all over the pasture. It illustrates past experiences. What that means is you see it because you experienced it, but the listener is trying to picture it. Storytelling establishes trust because you're letting your guard down. You're telling something personal about you. You tell a story about some event, whether it's funny or tragic, it makes you memorable. And that's the key. I remember this one lady coming in. She really hadn't had any work because she was taking care of her daughter, I believe, with some critical health issues where she was constantly in the ER. And then also working at a home for troubled teenage girls. So one of the job seekers and I in one of the workshops we're doing practice interviews with her. And she said, I really don't have any experience. So we started asking her questions like her background. So here's what this lady had done. At 2 hospitals, she was part of a committee. And in one situation, she was the head of the committee that the hospital wanted to reorganize their procedures to deal with these children to make sure they had the right medications on hand so that they're not experimenting. What about cell phones? You see in the hospitals, all the different cords for the different cell phones, the charging stations. She came up with these ideas and presented them to the hospital. She was talking to the C-level people, the CEO, the CNO, the COO, the CEO, and was presenting this. And the second part of the story is that as she was taking care of this one troubled girl, she was on 16 different medications, I think. Oh, it was horrible. And so by taking some concern and working with this girl, this lady helped her get off all but maybe one or two of the drugs. This lady eventually had to leave because this girl, who was an orphan, asked this lady to adopt her so she could be her daughter. And I mean, I'm telling you this because she said she had no experience, she had nothing relevant to present, and yet hidden deep down inside of her were these two huge experiences that I had tears in my eyes when she was talking about them. And she's memorable because she will stay with me for the rest of my life. That's what I'm talking about, making you memorable. It doesn't have to be as extreme as that, but we're going to talk about how you develop anchors to help people see what you do. And the other thing is you show enthusiasm and passion. You know, you be excited. You know, a lot of people just come in, yes, I want a job. You know, here's how you can help. No, light up. Show people you want to be there. Now, what great salespeople do is they talk about, I call it climbing up the ladder. I always tell job seekers, when we're walking in for the interview, we already think we got a job. And I know some salespeople say, well, I made the sales, I just have to close it. Well, before you go in for the first time, I think you need to establish some trust. And you establish trust, and again, this is from that book, What Great Salespeople Do, is you have to ask some questions. You have to be curious, find out their needs. What's their vision? One of the job seekers was in the interview, and they were firing questions at him. He says, well, let me ask you a question. What do you want me in this position to do? Where do you want to go? And so the marketing VP stands up and says, this is my baby, let me talk about it. And this guy talked for 5 to 10 minutes, went to a whiteboard, drew out everything, and told this job seeker, here's what I want done. And the guy says, I can do that. You see, but otherwise, if he didn't know, if he hadn't asked the question, didn't know the vision, he couldn't talk about how he was going to fit and be the right person for the job. And then that gets to the offer. You have to know these things, the vision and how you fit to get the job offer. Now, here's what they found with storytelling and how it affects the brain. One thing, it certainly engages. They've done neuroscience studies of the brain on storytelling, both for the storyteller and the listener. And there's the left half of the brain, which is analytical, and the right half of the brain, which is creative, basically. And what they found when they applied the electrodes to someone's head is that when they were listening to a story or telling the story, the electrical charges shooting back between the left and right side of the brain increased dramatically because both the listener and the storyteller were engaged. When you tell a story, you command attention, and you're connecting with the listeners emotionally, like that lady did. Okay, and when you tell a story, and I might have gotten some of the years or numbers wrong with this lady and the daughter, but I do remember the story, the emotional content, okay? And I'm going to talk about here synchronizes the brain. What's actually happening, and let's do this for a second, is you will line up, and you're trying to visualize what I'm saying. So here's a question I was asked in an interview when I was applying at the unemployment office. Can you handle taking a claim? The phone rings and you pick up the phone and it's an employer wants to give a job order. And in a nanosecond, I'm thinking, phew, that's a stupid question. Coming out of the Army, I was in charge of a maintenance motor pool. And my day was, and now remember, this is all nanoseconds in my head. I'm coming off the Autobahn at 0 dark 30, getting out of my Mercedes. Walk into the motor pool, there's total chaos in the night. There's tactical vehicles, administrative vehicles, drivers running back and forth, mechanics running back and forth. I open up the door to my dispatch office. There's like 6 or 7 drivers yelling at the dispatcher who's trying to dispatch the vehicles and give them keys. I walk in, I go to the left through a door, there's my supply clerk. He's telling me, hey, we need these parts, and I got to go pick them up for these vehicles. And then I take a right, I go into the motor sergeant in my office, and he says, we have vehicles down here and here. We got the maintenance team going out, and this was all through central Germany. We can go to Bad Hersfeld and Fulda and then pick up a vehicle on the way back from support maintenance. Now, while I'm telling you that, this was all happening in a second in my head. But see, the employer doesn't know that. The interviewer doesn't know that. So it's up to you to communicate it. Now, I'm hoping many of you were trying to picture what the heck I was talking about. See, as I was talking, I was actually visualizing the whole experience because I lived it every day for 5 years. You were trying to put it in some context that you understand to try and empathize or get in sync with what I'm talking about. And that's what happens in storytelling. Now, the other thing I found is that when you write out your stories, you bring the knowledge to the surface of the event. I was writing a paper for a training and development course, and I remember a significant accomplishment in the when I was in the Army as an advisor to the National Guard. And we were trying to get them to rewrite their mobilization plan. And I remember a quarterly 1-hour meeting with the general staff. I was a captain. And the general said, Captain, tell me what you found in the field. Well, that 10-minute presentation was a turning point in our getting the state to rewrite their mobilization plan. But when I had to write out all the steps, I forgot it took me 2 years to get there and another year afterwards to implement. I had to become a subject matter expert this was back in the 80s, on something very few people in the Army knew, which was mobilization. I had to go in the field, I had to read, I had to participate in exercises, I had to become a subject matter expert, enough that I was trusted by the National Guard to go out with them on their inspection teams and then be able to report back to the general and his staff. So I just remember the 10 minutes. But after that, then we had to implement it and test it. And years later, after 9/11, I found out that one of the units I was advising was the most activated or mobilized unit in the United States Army at that time. So it's kind of weird when you're in the moment. You don't realize the effects before or after. You just remember the moment. But by writing it out, now I have the whole experience that I can be prepared for follow-on questions. How did you deal with this? How did you deal with criticism? Who authorized you to do this? What issues did you come up with? What obstacles? I took the 7 classic quests or adventures, excuse me, and I turned them into what would be appropriate that you could talk about in an interview. So getting back into a career or job after you've been out for a while, returning to work after caregiving or taking care of the kids or sickness, winning the prize, exceeding quota, winning that trip, the $1 Million Club and insurance, exacting revenge, overcoming the competitor, or your company laid you off, you went to a competitor and you did even better there. Slaying the dragons, these are fears, okay? How did you overcome fears, or how did you hit the benchmarks? Rebirth in a new career, promotions, give you new energy. I'll just give you a quick example of this. I was having my knee x-rayed a few years ago, and now I always ask people, how did they get into the profession? And she said, well, I was working in logistics, and I was getting tired of the warehouse, And I went back to school when I was about 40 and I became an X-ray tech. I was like, wow, you know, that's what I'm talking about here, rebirth and a new career. Because I was so excited to do that. Climbing the mountain, difficult tasks, things that seem insurmountable, things that seem impossible. How did you conquer that? And then the other one is searching for your niche. What do you do? What you're great at? What's your passion? What makes you come alive? So discovering your interview stories. Who are you? What makes you tick? What gets you excited? What makes you go to work in the morning? What gets you energized? Always start with the awards or recognitions that you have, things that make you proud. How did you help your former company or customers? Don't overlook mistakes or failures. Those will be asked in behavioral interviewing. Remember what I said? Questions can be positive, questions can be negative. Disagreements with the boss, how did you resolve those? The successes, being able to collaborate, making a difference. Think of all the projects you worked on. You have to tailor your story, and this is important, to the different events, the people, the audience. You know, if you're talking, if you're a technical person and you're talking to a lay person or an 8-year-old, you have to adapt your language to an 8-year-old or an 80-year-old who's not in the field, versus if you're talking to a technical person. When you're networking, you know, you have to understand who that other person is and help them establish a picture in their head of how they can help you. Your resume, your accomplishment statements, those one-liners, are stories. All of them will have problem, action, result in them. Cover letters, you could put an example of that. Your telephone interviews will have truncated or shortened interview stories because you don't have that much time on the phone before you lose them, versus interviews where you can see people. Speaking the right language. Certainly there's different languages. I already told you about the training example. She was speaking German, I was speaking Russian, essentially. But there's musicians, there's, let's say a musician and someone who's in Six Sigma. You know, they might be talking in their technical terms to each other, but what's common ground? The process of writing music. So make sure you're able to adapt and be able to explain at various levels, from entry level to high level, your skill sets. Here's how you can use your stories. Pick a skill, give an example of how you use that skill, and what was the benefit to the employer or the customer. Identify an accomplishment, write a story about the accomplishment, and what was the benefit, again, to the employer or customer. It is now, it's how you tell the story. It's the pace of your voice. It's the volume. It's the nonverbals. You know, I'm trying to put my hands in here every once in a while, but I'm using them throughout the whole presentation. Your body posture, eye contact, gestures. You know, I had a at-risk youth I was given a workshop to about looking for jobs, and they all had attitudes. But when I asked them what they truly wanted to do, what their interests were, one girl, I mean, everything from dancing to architecture to one girl wanted to be, you know, a hairstylist. So at the time I had more hair than I do now. And I said, well, what would you do with my head? And I could literally see her visualizing my hair, and her hands were moving. It was fascinating to watch. Anchors. What anchors are is an actual product. So, you know, I've had people hold up my cell phone, you know, when I was doing practice interviews with them, and they hold up the cell phone and say, I worked on your cell phone. If we flip it over and we pull the back off, we look in the guts, here's what I did. Okay, so now, as I was doing that, I'm thinking of the specific individual. Another person held up a pen, He was a nuclear, he was a biochemist, PhD, who worked in a nuclear plant. He was explaining some process to me, and he just held up a pen just to show me how stuff worked. I said, oh, okay. Another guy in our job club, he stood up, painted at the fire alarm in the room and said, I worked on that fire alarm. So for 3 years now, whenever I walk into the room, whenever I see that fire alarm, I see him. I know exactly where he stood. I know exactly what he looks like. That's what I'm talking about with anchors. So we go from too few details in interviews like, tell me about a significant accomplishment. Well, we had this customer that was having this problem. We were called in, we figured out what the problem was, fixed it, and the customer was happy. Those are typical answers I get in the job search workshops, and sometimes even when I'm conducting interviews. Now, on the other side is too much information. This is where people go off the tracks, run out of the fencing, and run all over the pasture. I find this happens. I remember this one guy in particular was in IT. He just went so deep, and he was going, oh, well, this led to this, this led to this. It was just wandering aimlessly like a drunk down the street. Another lady, I asked her what she did. All I can remember is she said credit cards. And she went into all this detail about stuff. I'm like, what the heck? I said, what do you do with credit cards? Oh, when you go to Jewel and you swipe your credit card. I said, yeah. So I worked on the system that transferred, the logarithms from the bank to the Jewel. I said, oh, why didn't you say that? So we have a tendency, because we know too much, we want to get into the details. But here's what's, this nuke going off in my head sometimes is what happens. I'm trying to keep my eyes open, but inside my head, there's a nuke going off because I'm overwhelmed with too much information. So, as I mentioned earlier, when I was talking about the motor pool and interviewing at One Employment, I'm visualizing it, but the interviewers, they're not mind readers. So I had to paint a picture for them, not just to give a yes, I can answer, but yes, let me tell you about an experience I had when I was a maintenance officer in the Army in Germany. You see, and then I can go into that so that they can see I can handle walking and chewing gum at the same time. If you ask the basic questions, who, what, when, where, why, and how much, when you write out your answers, you're prepared for all these. But this is what people want to know. This is what flushes out a story. 7 steps to a successful interview. Well, you have to pick the right story for the right company and position. If I was interviewing for a cross-cultural training company, then I would talk about one of my significant accomplishments would be talking in German to German social workers coming to DuPage County for an orientation. But that story might not be as interesting to someone if I was applying to run a motor pool or a fleet maintenance for garbage trucks. You see, so I have to pick the right story for the right situation. Again, adapt it to the audience. If you're talking to human resources, you can't get as technical as if you're talking with the technical team. Make the point of the story clear, keep it short, practice, and be prepared for the follow-on. This is what behavioral questions do. They ask you one question, but you have to be prepared for the follow-on questions. And use your voice. So we're going to go through this. This is the story setting S, problem, action, result, and the tie-in. The story setting is the introduction. Who, what, where, when, and the customer. I would like to tell you about the time in my role. I would like to tell you about the time as a member of a team for this project. Who's the cast of character? Well, you're going to be the main character, but there's also supporting cast, people who helped you, teachers from the past that you called upon, mentors that said, okay, you taught me to do this. And villains, these are people who sabotage you. Now, if there weren't problems, there would be no need for heroes. So the villains, the problems could be low sales, poor customer service, poor attendance, defective parts, whatever it is. But villains provide a purpose for the hero, you. There's a purpose for you to take action, and they add excitement to the story. The problem, the challenge, the situation. Well, when was it dumped in your lap? Oh, by the way, we need this by close of business today. Wow, okay, you received the assignment. What were your reactions? What was the project? How do you deal with a difficult customer? How and why did you get involved? What was your initial reaction? Did you run towards it, run away from it? How did you assess the situation? Did you act as part of a team, or did you do it on your own individually? And what was your role in the team or the project? Now, when this goes online, I have made a list of questions for you to ask yourself for the problem, the action, and the result in a PDF file, which will be on our website. But these are the actions, okay? We already talked about what was the problem, actions. What did you do to attack it? Who was involved? What battles did you need to have fought? Did you fight them? Did you have to go to your manager or have people higher above to get resources allocated to you? Who were the critics, the saboteurs? You know, the people, well, why are we changing? We always did it this way, right? What tools and technologies did you use? What about your confidence or self-doubt? They ask these questions in interviews. You know, hitting the wall, sometimes it just seems so unsolvable. And I was reading a book on creativity about, you know, sometimes your problems are usually solved at 4 times. When you're sleeping, when you're driving, when you're exercising, or when you're in the shower, because you're not thinking about it at the time. And all of a sudden, the solution comes. Testing the solutions. What was the reaction of the staff, you know, when you tested it? What was the reaction once it was implemented? And this is where we get to results. Make money, save money, solve a problem, make things easier. Now the tie-in, and I learned this when I was interviewing for a position internally, which was in marketing at the time. And they asked me a significant accomplishment, and I was talking about this National Guard accomplishment. And I civilianized it. I went to general staff, to executive staff, and, you know, put in those terms. The manager and the administrator both knew me. They knew my background, and their heads were nodding yes, and they're smiling. You see, you got to watch people's body language. But the HR person, she was giving me the deer in the headlights look, and I said, whoa, okay, she ain't getting it. So I stopped my story. I said, okay, based on what I understand about this position, here are the skills I used to establish rapport and, you know, whatever came up. Once I pointed out how I connected to the position, then she said, okay, I got it now. You see, and that's what the tie-in is. Here are the skills I used. Here, or the other tie-in is, here's what I learned, or here's what we learned as a company to change the SOP. All right, so those are some examples you can use. So let's picture a funnel. You're starting over here and you're writing the details in, I don't care if it's 2 or 3 pages. Then you synthesize it down to problem, action, result. And then you synthesize it down to your introduction statement, which would be your story setting. Now in the interview, you go in the opposite direction. You start with the story setting, then you go to problem, action, result, and then you have the details available if they ask follow-on questions. So the preparation goes from left to right, and the interview goes right to left. Here's what I'm talking about, a story setting. I would like to tell you about the time in my role as position at this company where I did this, which resulted in this, which solved this problem. Here, I would like to tell you about the time in my role as a personal banker, a trainee at Thrifty Bank, where I caught a woman trying to cash, I don't know, $20,000, $30,000 worth of stolen company checks. Okay, that's the setting. Tell me more. The problem was action, results, and this is what happened. This one, I like to tell you about my time and my role as catering sales for Salary Catering. This lady, she had never done catering before. It was her thing. And she was doing an MS fundraiser, and she catered 14,000 meals over 2 days. I mean, these are some fantastic stories I've heard from job seekers once they wrote things out. So let me give you an example here how this works. I would like to tell you about the time as the workshop team leader for the Career One-Stop Center, where I initiated the creation of a catalog identifying 65 workshops that were being conducted by the 4 partner agencies. The problem was customers were coming into the Career One-Stop Center. We had all these workshops going, and they would go up to staff and say, what were these workshops about? You had the unemployment office, you had College DuPage, you had Parents Alliance, and you had us working at DuPage, all conducting workshops. I found a catalog of workshops I thought, well, that's pretty cool. Why don't we just make a catalog for the center? I took it to my administrator, and she says, well, take it to the workshop team. I presented my idea, showed them an example. I got buy-in. Took us at least 2 to 3 months to get it together, where we wrote a narrative of the workshop. We had the title, the narrative, and consistent throughout was 3 learning points. Here's what you will learn. The result was we identified over 65 different workshops on computer skills, job search, career exploration, interpersonal skills, which resulted in us publishing over 1,000 catalogs and also used it on our website as well. Here are the skills I used in this example that I believe would help me to be successful in this position. Now, I provided some 3 questions here. These are just basic behavioral questions. Take the time. Tell me about your involvement in a significant accomplishment or event. Tell me about a time when you had conflict with a coworker. Describe a time when you faced a difficult situation or customer. Here's 3 to start, and just write it out. Problem, action, result, and then have your statement overview. Again, you want the employer to remember something about you. You have to make yourself stand out from the rest of the other candidates, whether it's doing a presentation, using a whiteboard, visual aids, telling a significant story. I remember one guy here, I'm looking at the snow coming down today. I remember this one guy 2 polar vortexes ago worked for one of the telecoms, and the cell towers were down, the software. And all I can remember is him going up to the top of a cell tower trying, when it's like 20 below with the wind chill, God knows 70 below, trying to swap out something on the top of the cell phone tower. I remember that, See, those are the things that make stories and make you memorable. This will also be a PDF. It will start with pick an experience, skill, or tool. What was the story setting, company position? What was the problem, the event, or the customer? What actions did you take, tools you used, people or departments you interacted with? What were the results, and what lessons did you learn to tie in? So you'll be able to use this as well. This will be a PDF. So that concludes the presentation. I'm going to look in the chat room and see if there's any questions. Recent presentations that you'll find on YouTube was I've done a virtual interviewing. I think it's about 20 minutes, maybe, on how to do a virtual interview since they're becoming so well known now. My son just went through them when he got hired. He was supposed to go out to San Diego, but this pandemic started. So everything was done by, like we're doing now, virtual. Also, one of the candidates just got hired by a college out in Arizona. All his interviews were by Skype. Last week's Job Club, Opportunity in the Midst of Chaos, is also posted on YouTube. I would encourage you again to look at WorkNet2 page to see what offerings we have. We have job search workshops. We have a boot camp, which once you are working with one of our counselors, you will be able to see all 4 days or all 4 sessions of that. I recorded them. We also pay for training. If you have been laid off for COVID-19, there's a special section on our page for you to fill out an application so we can get you in. A lot of schools have gone online now. I don't think the truck driving schools did. That would be kind of wild, but there's still training that you can do online. You know, everyone's trying to figure this out right now, but I encourage you to do this. Those of you who are working with WorkNet2 page, the counselors, please email your counselor that you attended this session and use the code WDD, the number sign and 25. WDD, the number sign 25. Just email them that, text them, however you deal with your counselor, to let them know, and that would be your 30-day contact for the counselor that you attended this. I got this in late last night. A company called Amplify, it has 4 positions available. They work with, of all things, credit and debit card loyalty programs for banks and credit unions. You can go to their website, amplifyloyalty.com. Here are the open positions as of last night: business operations intern, director of analytics, technology intern, and quality assurance person. I put that on here because, you know, during last week's session, I said, well, look at part-time jobs. Companies are hiring. We have people interviewing. I just said we had a guy get hired by a college. He was out over a year for sure, probably a year, 3 months. And everything worked out well. Actually, it was because of an interview he had at Triton College. He networked his way in, and he got referred out to somewhere in Arizona. So get out there. I know it's tough now. I guess get out there virtually. Make your connections, do your interviews. Even if you get no in one interview, someone in there remembers you and refers you somewhere else. Okay, so let's see what's in the chat room here. Wow, okay, let's see. Just bear with me, I'm trying to read everything. First, the presentation is going to be posted on YouTube, and then I was talking with our social media person, and she will be posting it on our website. And when it's posted on our website, you'll be able to access those, the questions to ask and that format for setting it up. Let's see. So you're going to have 2 ways to get access this: YouTube and on our website. Let's see. Social media. No. Okay, I don't know what that was all about. Okay. Okay. Not sure what this all is. If you have questions, how old should stories be? Good one. I think it's going to depend on the position you're going for. Let's just take, I'm going to use myself as example because I know me. If I was going for an intercultural, the stories would probably be older, maybe talking German to someone who was Polish in the One-Stop Center a couple of years ago. The German social worker presentation was, whoa, I guess 20 years ago. And then also living and working in Germany for 7 years, experiences there. And plus, I think the other thing with intercultural is I would talk about one of the things I did with What Color Your Parachute is my ideal job was to work with people from other cultures. I thought I'd be going overseas, but the majority of the workshops sometimes 1/2 to 2/3 or 3/4 of the composition are people from other cultures. So those experiences, both recent and the past, is what I would use if I was going for a cross-cultural, intercultural trainer. You know, like when people are being sent to Germany or Russia to live there for 3 years or whatever, for those companies. Now, preferably employers want to see what have you done recently, but sometimes you might want to use an older story to show how you gain that experience. I always picture you have your main story and then the follow-on questions are mini stories to support the main story. I know that sounds confusing. I can't draw it out right now. But I would try to start with recent, and then I would go to older. But again, it's like I said, pick the relevant stories for the position you're going for. How much money of the voice have? What's voices? Pay stubs have what voice? I have no clue what that's about. I had this open but could not attend, much because of a work meeting. Yes, it will be shared. Okay, so again, I encourage you to go to our website, WorkNetDo page, and I am looking at doing how to use visual aids in your interview to help people see what you're doing. So with that, I am going to end the recording. Thank you.